Steve, you've recently written a book about forecasting. What's the main message of the book?
Well, the main message of the book is that the practice of forecasting is broken. And the reason why the practice is broken is people don't understand the principles of forecasting properly. And just to give you some evidence of why I think the practice of forecasting is broken, is that over the last 5 or 6 years, in any one quarter, something between 6 and 9% of all listed companies in the UK come up with some form of profit warning, each of which can affect the share price between 10 and 20%. So it's a widespread problem, and I think it's also a very significant problem.
Why do you think things are in this state?
Well, as I say, I think it's primarily because people don't think about what they're doing properly. And I come across 2 or 3 main misconceptions. The first misconception is that it's all really very straightforward and it's just a matter of common sense. And if you believe that, then when it goes wrong, it's either because people are dishonest or they're incompetent. In which case the logic goes, you replace the people and you solve the problem, but in my experience you don't. The second misconception is it's all terribly complicated, in which case you give it to some propeller heads in the corner of the room and you let them get on with it, and I think that's also a misconception. I think the third one is probably that people just think it's a form of budget on speed, and my belief is that forecasting is fundamentally different to the process of budgeting, and if you try to approach it as quick, fast budgeting, that you'll make mistakes there as well.
And so what should companies do about this?
Well, I think, as I say, it's a question of getting the principles clear in your mind. And then if you've got the principles clear, they provide some kind of framework for the technique of forecasting, most of which already exists. And my belief is that as human beings, we're actually very good at forecasting. You know, we forecast whenever we cross the road, for instance. But because we do it subliminally, below the level of consciousness, we don't really appreciate what it is we do. And so we go to work, and as quite often happens, we do things at work that we'd never do in our private life. So what I've tried to do in the book is to bring out what I believe are the 6 principles, which if you follow, will help you master forecasting, and take all of those tools and techniques and use them appropriately. And if I can go through each one in turn. Yeah. The first one of these is mastery of purpose, which is to be clear about why you're doing it. And put simply, you forecast in order to take decisions. You're effectively steering a business, just in the way that you would steer a ship. And probably what's most important is to be clear about what forecasting isn't. It's not about prediction, which is something you can only do in the very short term. And it's not about speculating in the way that you might do as part of a strategy exercise. So it's about steering, and just like steering a ship, you're partly constrained by what's happened in the past, but you have some freedom for manoeuvre. And the key thing here, and almost the most important thing to appreciate about forecasting, is there's a fundamental difference between where you want to go, which is a target, and where you're heading right now, which is a forecast. Which means there is a gap, and it's the closing of the gap which is the stimulus decision-making. And this is one reason why conventional budgeting is so inappropriate, because gaps are bad under conventional forecasting. So that's the first reason. And then first principle, and the other principles really follow on from that. The first one is timeliness, which means that there are 2 dimensions to this. Firstly, it's about how far ahead you forecast, and the answer to that is however long it takes you to enact a decision. So to go back to my sailing analogy, if you're in a supertanker and it takes you 2 miles to stop, you need to look 2 miles ahead. Yeah? If you're in a speedboat, you probably don't need to forecast at all. So that means you need to have a rolling forecast, which people may be very familiar with, but it also tells you how far ahead you need to look. The second issue to do with timeliness is about how frequently you forecast, and the answer to that is at the same rate of frequency at which things change. So if things change very quickly, then you forecast frequently. If things change slowly, you forecast slowly. And what that might mean is that some line items you forecast more frequently than others. And as you can see, both with the rolling horizons and the frequency point, this is very different to what you'd see with traditional budgeting. The second point is actionable. And what I mean by actionable is you need information where it's relevant for the purposes of decision making. So you need information on the incremental impact of activities which you might choose to change in order to change course. You don't need detail if that information is irrelevant for decision making. So you might have lots more granularity about projects and a lot less granularity in areas, say, like overheads, where traditionally, with a budgeting mindset, you collect a lot of information. So that's the second additional principle. The third is the forecast needs to be reliable. And what I mean by reliable is it needs to be free from bias and with acceptable variation. So I'm not saying a forecast for these purposes needs to be accurate. What's important is that it's accurate enough. And specifically that you don't get systematic error, which leads to all sorts of bad practice like second guessing and so on and so forth. And probably the one area where technique I don't believe currently exists is in how you measure forecasts to make sure that they're free of bias. The penultimate principle is aligned. And very often I find that in some organisations you might have multiple forecasts in the same organisation, and you'd never step on a ship if every crew member had a different forecast. So that's clearly bad practice, and yet you see a lot of it. So what I say is you need to have one forecast that everybody is aligned to, that all decision makers are aligned to, but also recognise that that forecast is always likely to be wrong. So you need to appreciate the risk around that forecast. So I'd recommend people produce range forecasts and that they have a playbook of things they could do if things turn out differently. I think the other important thing, and then we see this particularly in what's happened in the banking sector over the last couple of years, is you need to recognise the difference between normal variation, risk, and uncertainty, where things can be significantly different. And although you can't anticipate those or forecast them, what you can do is appreciate what they look like and spot them quickly and take action, appropriate action, before it's too late. The final principle is cost-effective. And to be honest, I chose cost-effective because it had a C and it made the mnemonic good. But what I really mean by that is that you need to recognise forecasting, if it's done well, needs to be a process, not an ad hoc activity. And like any kind of process, it needs to be well specified. You need to be very disciplined. You need to do it often. Practice makes perfect very much in forecasting. And you need to look at the results, learn and adjust accordingly. Just as a final point is, although what I've talked about is a lot about process and about technique, forecasting as a source of information is entirely dependent upon what people choose to tell you. So you can have the best process in the world, but if there are bad behaviours, people are punished for telling the truth, or people are rewarded for lying, then you will have poor results. So at the end of the day, process is important, but behaviour is just as important.